Good afternoon. My name is Dave Walrath. I am the legislative advocate for the California Retired Teachers Association. Thank you for joining us on this webinar regarding CalSTRS retirement security. With me today is Jennifer Baker. We work together as advocates for California Retired Teachers Association. Prior to working with CalEA, Jennifer worked as the education lobbyist for the California Teachers Association, and prior to that, with the California State Teachers Retirement System. She has a great background. She's worked in the legislature as staff and with other organizations. I'm very pleased to be able to be working with Jennifer representing you. And with that, I want to turn the program over to her because she's the person who put these slides together, and she has done a fantastic job on it. So, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Dave, for that warm introduction. And it's so nice to virtually meet all of you, my new friends and partners working together to keep CalSTRS in a strong position. I did want to go over a few technical details for today's webinar by letting you know that if you have a question, you need to write your question down in the question box. On your screen, you're going to see a little toolbar, and you'll see one of the lines says questions. There's a little arrow to the left of where it says questions. If you click on that arrow, it's going to expand a box, and then you can click on in that box. You can write down a question and submit your questions. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the workshop, and Dave and I will be answering as many questions as we can during the question and answer segment of the workshop. We will not have time to take questions orally, so you are going to need to write your questions down throughout the workshop. We also have 3 polls that we're going to be conducting later on in the workshop. So we're going to pause, we're going to send a poll to you, and we're going to ask all of you attendees to participate in the poll by selecting the answer, and then you will need to submit, to click the submit button, and I'll be going over the rules for those polls when they happen. So with that, I want to say thank you. Dave and I are going to turn our cameras off so that we can actually focus on the PowerPoint itself, and we'll get started. So we're going to be covering CalSTRS in the age of COVID-19. We're going to be covering quite a bit of technical information here, and wanted to make it as enjoyable as possible since there are a lot of things that we're thinking about right now. So really what we wanted to do is take you back to the future again. We've been in tight spots before, and we're going to go through it again. So we're going to cover CalSTRS in the age of COVID-19. So in this workshop, we're going to cover a few different items. We're first going to be covering the investment changes to CalSTRS' assets. We're also going to be covering future changes that are going on in regard to the rate of return for CalSTRS, both short and long-term changes that may happen to contribution rates to CalSTRS. We're going to be talking about some of the different budget complexities of school funding and also general fund pressures that can impact school district budgets and how they can impact CalSTRS. We're also going to be covering various political threats that are beginning to emerge, and they are also the type of political threats that tend to emerge when we see shortfalls to public pension systems. And most importantly, we're going to also discuss the various strains within the system and what you can do to be active. So first, great Scott, we've got investment changes that are happening to CalSTRS' assets. It's enough to make a mad scientist go crazy. Here's the good news. Over the long run, CalSTRS has really performed strongly. If you look at the long-term investment results that CalSTRS has had, you can see that while we've had various dips in the economy, over the long run, CalSTRS has recovered quite strongly. Just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic starting, CalSTRS actually had over $250 billion in their cumulative assets. And they had performed quite a strong recovery after the Great Recession that we saw. The current rate of return assumption for CalSTRS is 7%. They base that over a 30-year projection. So you can see that even at a 7% rate of return in a downturn, over the long run, CalSTRS is looking to have a very strong future. Unfortunately, though, the COVID-19 pandemic has really shaken economic markets, not only in the United States, but around the globe as well. So even though they had close to $250 billion of assets prior to COVID-19, they lost close to $25 billion just within about a month. So that is a very strong impact that the markets have had on CalSTRS' investment performance. And CalSTRS also does have a very strong exposure to the US economy. 72.5% of their entire portfolio is invested in the United States. CalSTRS has also noted that restarting the economy, as we're beginning to slowly see, will be quite complex. It could impact the fall election if we do see a resurgence, and it can have long-term impacts on the economy, depending on whether or not the markets are going to be able to recover in a short amount of time, or if it looks like it might be more economically complex and could take a longer period of time. So this is heavy. This is.
And before, Jennifer,
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Before we go there, if we can go back to the other slide. Here we go.
One more?
When you look at that, you'll see, one more, please, yeah. So we had this major downturn, loss of 25 billion. But when you look at the historical, that's why I want to go back. As Jennifer started the presentation, we have been here before. It is back to the future. So looking at that, remember that CalSTRS is a long-term investor. They're not traders, they're investors. And because of that, they're able to weather sharp downturns and have gains in recovery and as the economy expands. The 25-year has been about 8% above the assumed 7. So you'll see that they have always recovered in the past, and there's every reasonable expectation that they will again as we go forward. And I want to show this to give assurance that, yes, there was a steep down, but they've had that before. In 1983, an even steeper, greater percentage loss in a 1-week period, and they recovered from that.
And
Okay,
Dave,
Jennifer,
it's
if
important.
we can go back to the.
Yes, and what I would love to do to complement what Dave just noted, at the most recent CalSTRS board meeting, CalSTRS' system actuaries actually noted that while this has been a dramatic economic decline, CalSTRS has seen worse declines in the past, and they've recovered. Anticipating these kind of declines are what they do as part of their duties as staff. So while it's certainly not a pleasant experience, it's something that CalSTRS staff is certainly prepared to act on. That said, it can lead to long-term changes in contribution rates. So as Marty McFly would say, this is heavy. It's heavy stuff, and it could have long-term changes that could impact the general fund and school district budgets. So we did want to take a little bit of time to talk about some possible rate changes that could take place depending on where we see markets go. So as Dave had noted before, the current rate of return that CalSTRS has is 7%. The Teachers Retirement Board, and for those of you that might not be familiar, the Teachers Retirement Board, their role is to actually manage CalSTRS as a whole. So they're responsible for making sure that that ship is sailing, and they have begun to chew on conversations about changing the future rate of return. There have been multiple board members that have already begun to indicate that it might be necessary to lower the rate of return from that 7%. So discussions could take place sometime in the future about changing that rate of return to either 6.75% or even 6.5%. I should note that CalSTRS does not have these discussions lightly. There was a time in the past when the CalSTRS rate of return was at 8.25%. Each time CalSTRS has made a decision to lower the rate of return, they have tended to lower it 0.25%. That at least has been the precedent. I don't think it would be unreasonable for them to consider having a discussion about changing the rate of return to 6.75%. But again, that's going to depend on a number of factors that are going to be presented to the Teachers Retirement Board. And the good news is the current actuarial unfunded obligation, and that's also known as a UAO, but let's just make it easy. What that really means is that's the shortfall that we have to the CalSTRS defined benefit plan. That's down from $107.2 billion to $105.7 billion as of June 30th, and that was just updated from numbers from CalSTRS's recent actuarial valuation that they compiled just a few weeks ago at their last board meeting. So think of that like a mortgage. So when you have a mortgage and you're paying interest, typically you don't start to see your principal go down as quickly because you're taking care of a lot of that interest. So the fact that we've seen that shortfall go down by close to $2 billion is very significant, and it means that we're already starting to move the needle to address the long-term shortfall to CalSTRS. I was able to find out from CalSTRS's system actuaries that every time they move down by 0.25% in their rate of return, that does increase that unfunded obligation or the shortfall by approximately $11 billion. So if the CalSTRS board, the Teachers Retirement Board, did choose at a later period of time to move the rate of return from 7 to 6.25%, that would make now the new shortfall would be close to $117 billion, just to provide some context. If the Teachers Retirement Board did make any rate changes, those changes don't take effect until July 1st of the next fiscal year. So if they did make a decision later on this year in 2020 to make a change, to pull that trigger, the actual start of the rate change wouldn't begin until July 1st of 2021. And additionally, if they needed to make a decision at a later period of time to change the employer contribution rates, under AB 1469, which is the long-term plan to give CalSTRS full funding, that 1469 gave the Teachers Retirement Board the authority to change the employer contribution rates by up to 1%, either moving up or moving down. So at the last CalSTRS board meeting, when they accepted the updated actuarial valuations, it did move employer contribution rates for the next 2 years slightly down based on a supplemental payment the state had paid to CalSTRS in last year's budgets. There have been some changes proposed to some of those decisions that we're going to be discussing later on in some of the slides regarding the May revise. So now we're going to get into some contribution rates with employers, employees, and the states. Contribution rates. So what I would say right now is roads. Where we're going, we don't need roads because, as you know, working with government, typically we like to make our own roads to make them go where we want them to go. First, wanted to touch upon the employee and the employer rates. Based on the updated actuarial valuations that were finalized earlier this month, we still have the employee contribution rates are 2% at 60 members will still have their 10.25% rate, and that's steady and solid and can't be changed. The 2% at 62 rate, otherwise known as PEPRA members, their rate is still at 10.205%. The employer contribution rates are changing slightly based on some updated numbers. So for 2019, based on the supplemental payment that was provided in last year's budget, the updated employer contribution rate for 2019 would be 17.1%, in 2020, 18.4%, and then in 2020 would shift to 18.3%. So I want to plant a seed that we are going to be coming back to employer contribution rates later on in the presentation, but wanted to provide a snapshot of where we are today.
And before we leave the slide, circling back to the 2% at 62, the PEPRA members, those newly hired after January 1, 2013. That is not a fixed rate in the same way as the 2% at 60 members. The 2% at 60 members have, under the California rule, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, that is a protected rate and can only be increased if they receive a benefit enhancement comparable to the cost of the increase. The new employees after January 1, 2013, the PEPRA, do not have that protection. They have to pay half of the CalSTRS normal cost. If the normal cost increases enough, then they have an increased contribution rate. Normal cost has a number of factors, one of which is the rate of return. So if the rate of return is significantly reduced, then it's possible that the contribution rate for these newer, younger members would be increased. And moving on to the next slide.
And unfortunately, if I could add one other aspect, if it were to increase, it is possible that the new PEPRA members could be paying close to 11%, which means that they would be paying a much higher contribution rate than other teachers that are working in a classroom just next door. So it really separates those two tiers to much more of an extreme level, potentially. So the next slide is where we start to get into the state's contribution rates. And under AB 1469, which again is the CalSTRS full funding plan, the state is capped at giving 0.5% of payroll annually to CalSTRS for their share of the shortfall to the defined benefit plan. What AB 1469 had also noted is any new shortfalls that are created fall under the obligation of the state, which means it's the state's job to fill that gap. So under the new actuarial valuation that was finalized, the state's rates for 2019-20 would be 7.828%, and for 2021, 8.328% of payroll. And at the last CalSTRS meeting, the CalSTRS actuaries had noted that in order for the state to meet its current obligations, in addition to the 0.5% increase that the state is paying this year and next year, that they would still have 2 more years of 0.5% contribution increases to CalSTRS in order to make their obligation whole. And I want you to remember that statement because we're going to be talking about state contribution rates again later on when we bring up the May revise. So we also have potential future contribution rate changes that could be happening depending on where we go. So as Dave had noted, our 2% at 60 members are capped, again at the 10.25%, unless a new funding plan with offsets are created. So for those of you that were perhaps still working back when the AB 1469 funding plan was created, there might be a few of you brand new retirees out there. This potentially could have impacted you. So let's say that you planned on retiring in 2016. You retired in 2016, and for your last 1 to 2 years of employment, you were paying a higher contribution rate. But in order to offset that, your 2% COLA was vested. That was the trade-off that the state had put into place in order to give you an offsetting benefit because you were paying higher contribution rates. One of the nice benefits is that when AB 1469 was created, we were able to work to ensure that that was not only applicable to active members, but to future retirees as well. But unfortunately, as Dave did note, that our PEPRA members could see increased future rates that wouldn't have to be offset. So here are some examples of what we would see if we had contribution rate changes. If we had a 6.75% contribution rate, or excuse me, 6.75 rate of return for CalSTRS, that would increase the PEPRA members by 0.5%. If CalSTRS had to lower the rate of return to 6.5, then those PEPRA members would likely see a 1% increase. So that would give them up to 11.205% rate or contribution rate for our PEPRA members, which would really hurt because they would be paying more from their paychecks, while we already see employers paying more as well as the state. The employer rates for the next fiscal years are estimated to stay at that 17.4%, although again, we're going to talk about that in the May revise section. And as I've noted, the state's contribution rate is increasing 0.5% each year. So if I've included what those 0.5% increases would be. So for 2021, it would be 8.328%. At 8.828, excuse me, in 2021-22, 9.328 in 22-23, etc. So again, also to know the dollar amount for every 0.5% increase in the state's contribution rates with today's figures, that it's about $180 million. So that is also estimated to increase by 3.5% next year just due to payroll growth. But again, remember these state contribution rates because that's a hot topic in the May revise this year. So
and
now
you'll note that only teachers are differentiated. The employer rate is the same regardless of the date they hire the teacher. The state contribution, the same. Only are the teachers are the only ones that have the two different. As you see from Jennifer's, the 0.5% increase in their contribution if it was a 6.75. Because they are tied to normal costs, CalRTA has been very concerned about any legislation that would have an effect of increasing normal costs. And so the association has opposed bills that would make that type of increase because we did not believe that the newer, younger educators with lower salaries should have to have a contribution increase because of that type of legislation.
And as a matter of fact, CalRTA has lobbied along with other educational stakeholders when AB 1469 was being negotiated to try to minimize some of the impact that some of the negative impacts that PEPRA had on new teachers, because they were going to have basically have to work longer and receive a lower retirement benefit. That was one of the reasons that when AB 1469 was created, it actually had created a lower contribution rate increase for new members to try to offset that and give them as much of an equal footing. But unfortunately, one of the negative impacts of PEPRA was that it ensured that new members would have to pay for 50% of the normal retirement costs. So as we have seen the normal cost of retirement creep up when it comes to CalSTRS, that unfortunately has eroded and then eliminated that equal playing field that advocates had worked so hard to achieve. So we're going to give you some more detailed information. So hopefully your mind is not fried. Don't worry, it's not all scary. But what I would say is something's got to be done about your kids, Marty, because it's getting very complicated. And as you all know from the work that you've done for your careers, it's expensive. And education is never funded adequately. But Dave and I did want to give you a perspective of school budgets and the state general fund, because they are both having a direct impact on conversations about CalSTRS right now. So what has happened is we have a new normal for schools and school fundings. And that normal right now, I would equate it to chaos. Somewhat organized chaos. When we started the year, remember the before times. You remember the before times when we could go out. We had a budget surplus, and that budget surplus was $5.6 billion. We had record reserves, $21 billion of record reserves. There were discussions about expanding programs. There were conversations about trying to equalize special education funding, trying to increase the total amount of ADA that school districts are given for our kids. But unfortunately, many of those discussions have been sidelined because of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has had, unfortunately, a severe impact on the global, the national, and our state economies. So by the end of April, we've had close to 500,000 individual unemployment claims were filed, which is absolutely significant. That's just in California alone. The Department of Finance has been projecting that the unemployment rate for California is going to be up even higher potentially than 18%. And I do need to note that number is significantly higher than what we saw in the Great Recession, indicating that this may be a much more complicated recession than we saw in the last decade. And unfortunately, we're also expecting that personal income is expected to fall by close to 9% in 2020. And we've already seen the impacts of that in our local communities. One of the reasons why we're also seeing an impact on the general fund is because the revenue sources that our state general fund uses for our budgets have declined. So when we look at both the job losses and the business closures that we've seen, both small and large businesses that have been closing, that has had a significant impact on reducing the overall state revenue. So there's three types of revenue that our general fund is relying upon to keep that general revenue, our general fund pot full. And the three buckets that go in to fill the general fund are our personal income tax, which we've seen decline by over 25%, our sales and use tax, which has declined by over 27%, and our corporation taxes have declined by over 22%. We still haven't seen what the total losses are going to be on all of our various tax revenues as our state taxes have been delayed, but the Department of Finance is estimating that the impact is unfortunately going to be quite severe, which means that we're going to see a very negative hit to the general fund overall. And because of that hit, we will now have a new deficit for the state general fund. So the Department of Finance is estimating that when we look at the cumulative impacts of our revenue losses, that the overall decline will be over $41 billion below what the initial January projections were going to be. So cumulatively, what it means is overall, we have an over $54 billion shortfall or deficit. Over 13 billion of that is in our current fiscal year, and close to 41 billion of that shortfall is going to be in our next budget year. What that means is for school funding, Proposition 98 is based on what the total amount of funds are in the general fund. So typically schools would get, it was approximately 38 to 40%, but if you think about it, whatever the general fund is, Prop 98 gets close to 40% of that. So for every dollar of a reduction we see in the general fund, 40 cents of that dollar is money that would have gone to schools. So because that overall deficit is over $54 billion, what that means is that the share of cuts to Prop 98 are going to be over $18 billion for both our schools and community colleges because they're funded out of Prop 98. And there are additional cost pressures are mounting. So for schools have seen increased costs because of COVID-19. Our schools have been shut down. Those of you that have grandkids have seen that your sons and daughters are working to take care of their kids at home. I have a kindergartner at home, and those of our CalRTA members that are on various committees that I've been giving reports to have seen my daughter popping in. So this is a real new environment that schools and parents and communities are having to face because we're looking at distance education. And we don't yet know what the fall is going to look like. Because of the severe cuts to education that our school districts are facing, many of them aren't quite sure how and when they'll be able to open up because there are so many new costs that they're seeing on top of the already inadequate funding that they were receiving even prior to COVID-19. But some discussions that are beginning to emerge are around having smaller classes, perhaps staggered classes, along with utilizing distance education. Where this gets complex is if you have staggered classes, you still have to clean in between those classes. You still have to provide personal protective equipment, not only to our teachers, but to kids as well. And so there are so many unanswered questions, and because we still don't understand the depths of which COVID-19 does impact us, it's hard to predict what is the best way to prepare for those unanswered questions. But what we do know is that even prior to COVID-19, we had a systemic lack of adequate funding for our schools. And so now we're just adding that fuel to the fire. And unfortunately, significant cuts are looming because we now have a budget shortfall and we do have reductions that are being proposed to Prop 98. On top of that, we also have declining enrollment. That has been something that can impact our long-term funding for schools. So we do have a few more issues, some hard negative issues, but stay with us. It's not all bad. We do have increased statewide costs for addressing COVID-19. So we do have approximately a little over $7 billion in total costs for helping to ensure we can cover the needs for our state for COVID-19. So these costs include providing funding to help with hospitals and our county offices, to provide personal protective equipment and the various resources that they need to keep our communities moving. And also just in practical emergency response to COVID-19, we are seeing increased state costs of approximately $6 billion. On top of that, let's make your blood boil a little, because if I haven't traumatized you enough, let me traumatize you a little bit more. But remember, it always gets darker before it gets light. So it's not the end of the world yet. But you should know that even though we have all these cuts that education is facing, we're also looking at various cuts that might be happening to healthcare. While that's still happening, though, California still has billions of dollars that's being spent on corporate tax credits and exemptions with little to no accountability and transparency. For every dollar of a tax credit or an exemption that's being provided, 40 cents on the dollar of those tax credits are money that would have gone to education. So you could potentially eliminate all cuts to education, to healthcare and other areas by ensuring that there's adequate transparency and accountability on the existing tax credits and exemptions that we have. So what I mean to say with that in the long run is that California does have more tools in its tool bag to deal with some of these economic pressures that we're seeing on education and in dealing with COVID-19. But California's leadership and our legislators and governors are going to have some very complex discussions if they want to try to get out of this in a positive way. So now that we have an idea of what the state shortfall is, I did want to let you know that the Legislative Analyst's Office recently weighed in an unprecedented move. The Legislative Analyst's Office is an independent agency, and they are essentially the recommenders of policy and fiscal decisions to the legislature. It's like an independent body to give the legislature perspective to help them as they're weighing various policy or fiscal goals. Typically, the Legislative Analyst's Office weighs in the fall with various comprehensive perspectives. But in an unprecedented move, the LAO decided that as soon as they found out that the Department of Finance was estimating that we were going to have such a large $54 billion shortfall, the LAO thought it would be appropriate to say, we have our own thoughts about that perspective, which is quite interesting, and it adds a level of complexity of thought to these discussions for the legislature and the governor as we move forward. So the good news is, and there is some good news in here, so let me again not paint a totally bleak picture. The LAO has estimated that they don't think that it's going to be as bad as what the state is estimating with a $54 billion shortfall. So the LAO has assessed that we're likely to see two different types of recessions, that we may see a U-shaped recession. This is similar for those of you that did watch the last CalSTRS investment committee meeting. Their Chief Investment Officer, Chris Ailman, also discussed a possible U-shaped recession. That's a more optimistic recession, and that means if we're able to deal with the negative part of the recession and snap out of this economic recession in a relatively short period of time, that we would probably only have a cumulative budget shortfall of about $18 billion. But the LAO has also said that while we're optimistic, that doesn't mean that's what reality might be. And they wanted to also prepare for a more pessimistic or more conservative recession. And that recession that they created a scenario for is known as an L-shaped recession, which means it would be more pessimistic, it would last a longer period of time, and the low may be lower. Should we have an L-shaped recession, the LAO is estimating that we would have a budget shortfall of approximately $31 billion. Even in the lowest estimate, the LAO's number is certainly much higher, though, than what the Department of Finance has projected by over $20 billion. So the good news is it might not be as bad as the Department of Finance is estimating. But the LAO has noted that they do believe that the budget deficits that we're likely to see are going to last for a few years, perhaps up to 2023-24, and the long-term cumulative impact of those shortfalls is likely to be anywhere from $64 billion to $126 billion, depending on which kind of recession that we're likely to see. The other good news that they shared with us is that we do have $16 billion in reserves. And the good news is that's a tool that we didn't have in the Great Recession. So we're $16 billion higher than we were when we started the last recession. We can't use all of that money all at once. We're only able to use a little bit in each year. But if we're able to use the first $10 billion in our upcoming fiscal year, we're still going to have a gap, but we're not as bad as we were when we started the Great Recession. So what the LAO has noted is that it would be much better for the state to recover quickly if the legislature and the governor were to put all of the final recommendations of what their decisions are going to be for the current and the future fiscal year. If they finalize those decisions by June 15th, because this way it allows our local governments the ability to plan and prepare for what we're going to have to deal with, as well as to begin to implement some solutions. It's not likely that all of those decisions might take place by June 15th. It's very possible that we'll see, we are definitely going to see our constitutional deadline of passing a budget by June 15th met, but we still don't know whether or not all of those decisions will happen by June 15th, or whether or not we'll see a second run of a budget created in the month of August. But we can touch on that as we weigh in on the next few slides. In other news as well, we've also had Congress weighing in. The federal government has taken serious action in regard to COVID-19. We already saw the CARES Act pass, which has provided quite a bit of funding for states and for schools, and we're going to touch on how some of that's being utilized when we cover the May revise. But recently, as of last week, the House had proposed a HEROES Act, and that would provide over $101 billion for both states, school districts, and higher education for coronavirus response, as well as providing $9 billion for state fiscal stabilization funds to essentially help our elementary and secondary schools to deal with COVID-19. It would also provide additional funding, up to $5 billion for schools and libraries, to meet the increased needs of internet service. We do have a huge gap when it comes to getting adequate internet service for a number of families. If this HEROES Act or an equivalent were to be passed, that would eliminate a huge gap that we're beginning to see emerge in states' fiscal needs to address not only the statewide fiscal needs in dealing with COVID-19, but also to help to provide a cushion so that schools across the country don't have to look at significant cuts. It's not likely that we're going to be seeing any action on this within the next few weeks, but we're looking forward to seeing where the discussions will go when it comes to the federal level. And finally, the much anticipated May revise slide that I've been hinting at throughout most of the presentation. There have been some very significant retirement proposals that have been included in the May revise that I wanted to make sure that you were aware of. Essentially, the May revise has proposed a pension holiday for the states. So remember in previous slides that I noted that based on the most recent actuarial valuation for CalSTRS, the state was going to have a 0.5% increase contributions for this year, next year, and then 2 more years in addition to that. In the May revise, in order to save general fund dollars, the state has proposed that they're not going to be paying those 0.5% increases in state contribution rates to CalSTRS, essentially for the next 3 to 5 years. And what that would mean is a gap would be created. So that would mean that when the state did begin to pay that 0.5% increase to CalSTRS, they would not only have to make up those 5 years, but now they're also going to be on the hook for the gap that's being created since that money is not being invested. So it could potentially take 8 years or, you know, maybe even 10 years to make up that shortfall. And while the action does, it does save immediate cuts from taking place to schools and in the budget, but in the reality, it does create longer term costs for the state. And what we have got an indication from the Department of Finance, they're assessing that in the future that they'd be able to utilize rainy day funds or Prop 2 funds to be able to fill that gap for the state. And I do want to also plant that the feisty part of me also wants to say, for those of you that were around when Pepper was created, it was something that that groups were adamantly in opposition to. One of the primary reasons that Pepper was created was because there were pension holidays that were taking place at local levels, and that was used as justification for having to rein in CalSTRS, CalPERS, and 1937 Act County pension systems, as well as others. And unfortunately, the state is now proposing a pension holiday for themselves. So it's quite ironic, but nevertheless, it would prevent further cuts from taking place, not only in education, but in other parts of the budget. So it does appear that the state does want to ensure that CalSTRS stays whole in the long run. They are essentially using their contributions to CalSTRS as a short-term piggy bank. It also proposed, the May revise also proposed to shift the contribution rates that were created under AB 1469. And they actually specified what the contribution rates would be. So essentially, those rates would be lowered for school employers for 2020 and for 2021. And the rates would be lowered from the approximately 17.1% to about a little less, potentially around 16%, somewhere around there. We're still trying to get clarity about what the exact numbers would be, because we do have some differences from what we're hearing from CalSTRS and from what we're hearing from Department of Finance. But it's the state's intent to give employers some pension contribution relief to help to mitigate the cuts that are happening at the local level. And they're using the supplemental fund that they had previously paid to CalSTRS to pay for that contribution rate relief to employers. So while it would potentially free up additional budget cuts from taking place, now the supplemental payment that CalSTRS was using to lower the long-term obligations, those funds are now no longer going to be there. So the overall the paying down of the CalSTRS shortfall that they were planning on, that's not going to take place as projected. So we're still trying to get new updated numbers from CalSTRS as to what this would mean towards the long-term payment plan. So maybe it wouldn't be paid off as quickly, but we would still be on the same trajectory to move forward. And I did get clarification from the Department of Finance. It's not their intent to undo AB 1469 in any way. It's their intent to try to provide a little flexibility for employer contribution rates, but that after this new plan is put into place, we would revert back to the rate setting authority that the Teachers Retirement Board has to be able to determine what the employer contribution rate would be. And it also anticipates that that the state's contribution rates would kick in after their holiday. So I know that's quite a bit of information to ingest. And so hopefully you're still with me as we move forward to some of the most complicated issues, because just as we're trying to make sure we keep CalSTRS fully funded and make sure our long-term funding plan is there. Yeah, Dave.
A comment, and this is to congratulate Jennifer because of the work she has done on the tax credit issue. the May revision proposes to reduce the tax credits for corporations who are taking more than $5 million a year in tax credits, which will generate significant money for the state, some of which will be available for schools. And so this is a shout out to her for her leadership on that issue, which the administration did adopt partially, not as much as we may have wanted, but they adopted the concept that corporations, big corporations with lots of tax credits, should share in the pain, not simply schools and other public services.
And thank you, Dave, for noting that. And essentially, what the way that I've been framing it is school districts should not be subsidizing corporate America. And unfortunately, that has been set up economically for the state. So as long as it's justifiable, as long as you're able to note that we have economic benefits to the state, that the jobs you're saying were actually created, and we see the economic impact from that, there's not a problem. But if you can't show that, then you are literally cutting money from schools and kids in order to subsidize something that you can't prove that we're getting a benefit from. So as we've had some of those more complex discussion with Department of Finance and the governor's office, they have begun to yield and realize, hate to say it, but you're right. And so we saw that used as a tool for this, and to the extent that additional conversations take place and get put into action, that could potentially mitigate future budget cuts to schools. So we're trying to help the legislature and governor realize all the economic tools that are in their toolbox, and we're already seeing some positive reaction in that. So thank you for that, Dave. We did want to make sure that you also knew that some are taking advantage of this economic situation to throw stones at CalSTRS. So I would equate this to the bolt of lightning, and you never know when it's going to strike. But it just as in Back to the Future, they knew when a bolt of lightning was going to strike. And unfortunately, Dave and I have both known that whenever you start to see new shortfalls emerge or a downturn in the economy, you're always going to have various people come out of the political fray to start throwing stones at CalSTRS and defined benefit plans. So we did want to go over some of the risks to CalSTRS that we have been seeing emerge and make sure that you knew that we knew what's out there. There is a Supreme Court ruling that's going to be taking place in August. And actually, Dave, did you want to cover this now, or you want to get into some of the details later on?
Very quickly right now. The California rule says that an employee is vested with the retirement program in place at the time of hiring. And the issue before the court is whether that can be changed without collective bargaining. Currently, it can be changed if both parties, the employee and, well, the organization representing the employee and the employer, mutually agree. What is before the court is whether the employer can unilaterally change that agreement. And so that is a major issue because CalSTRS, under the California rule with its vested benefits, give assurance and reliability to retirement income. This would not have a significant effect on current retirees if it were changed, which we hope it won't be, but if it were, it would probably affect primarily current employees and the types of benefits they would earn for future service. More on this later, not in this webinar, but when we have a better understanding of the court and the court's opinion.
Thank you for that, Dave. And we have also seen increased conversations about replacing the CalSTRS defined benefit plan with the defined contribution plan. And I would equate a defined contribution plan, it would be very similar to a 401k style of plan that does not have security or adequate benefits. We did see an introduction of a bill just recently, AB 2998 by Assemblymember Kiley in the legislature. It would have eliminated mandatory participation in CalSTRS, and it was an attempt to try to eliminate the CalSTRS defined benefit plan. Thanks to your help, and I can't thank you enough for those of you that made phone calls, for those of you that sent emails to legislators to stop that bill. It was CalRTA that was able to stop that bill in its tracks, and I really have to extend my gratitude to you. But the fact that we saw legislation like this introduced is really likely to be an unfortunate sign of the times. When we had the dot-com bust and then the Great Recession, during those years, we regularly saw multiple anti-defined benefit bills that were introduced, and there were multiple initiative attempts that were tried during those times as well. It is likely and it is possible that we may see an emergence of additional defined contribution bills introduced and potential retirement initiatives that could be filed. The good news is we're aware that that's something that might take place, and we're already working behind the scenes to try to make sure that we're mitigating those efforts. One of the other aspects that has also been a tool in the past has been anti-pension articles and reports that increase. So just like sometimes there is fake news or news that is not real, we have also seen many different, I would call quote unquote reports that are manipulated, that are using data that's skewed or not accurate to try to paint a negative picture about defined benefits and teachers and how expensive they are to education. And so we're aware that that's happening, and we're working to fight back behind the scenes, and if necessary, change the level of tactics that we need to use to make sure that we're addressing those issues. I'm going to pause for just a moment to take a poll. Now that you're officially probably a little traumatized, and I'm going to give you some good news in just a minute. I wanted to take a moment to share one of our polls with you. And the question is, do you feel confident that your CalSTRS retirement is secure? Can you please take a moment to either click on yes, no, or not sure? After you make your selection, please hit the submit button, and I'll share those results with you. We just want to again ask you, do you feel that your CalSTRS benefit, your CalSTRS retirement is secure? Yes, no, or not sure. Going to give you about 15-20 more seconds to give all of you an opportunity to vote. Again, do you feel confident that your CalSTRS retirement is secure? Yes, no, or not sure. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share those results with you. So 51% of you feel that yes, your CalSTRS retirement is secure. 14% of you do not feel it's secure. 35% of you are not sure. And so I want to thank you for sharing that. We're going to use that information to help more of you to feel more secure. We want to do what we can to make sure that you are feeling secure. So with that, let's actually give you some positive news. Because it's not all bad, it's not all doom and gloom. There are risks, but we have quite a few strengths as well. And Marty McFly's dad had said, I'm your destiny, or no, actually your destiny. The reality is CalSTRS is your destiny, and we're here to try to make sure that that is maintained. So did want to let you know that CalSTRS has very deep roots. And as Dave noted earlier, CalSTRS used to be in a worse position in the past. In 1975, CalSTRS was only in the 20% funded status. So they've seen money ups, many downs. The good news is CalSTRS is over 100 years old. They survived a depression, a Great Recession, and multiple recessions in addition to that. They also do have, they're on track right now to full funding through AB 1469. And whether or not we see the May revise go into effect as proposed, that would still keep CalSTRS on track towards full funding. It may or may not take an additional year or two or a few years, but the reality is CalSTRS is actually in a stronger place now than they were at the beginning of the Great Recession, because they have the tools that they need to adjust contribution rates minimally to get CalSTRS on the right course. The reality, though, is future tweaks might be necessary to ensure full funding, but they can take place within reasonable timeframes. It's not something that has to happen absolutely right now, because we are in a good place. We're continuing to ensure that CalSTRS moves towards a good place of full funding. The good news is your pension is in good hands. CalSTRS knows what they're doing. They've been through this before. Jack Enos, the CalSTRS CEO, was actually planning on retiring in just a few months. But once COVID-19 hit, the board had a conversation with him and asked him if he would consider delaying his retirement until later next year. He said absolutely. He thought that was the right thing to do. And in addition, CalSTRS' Chief Investment Officer, Chris Ailman, has been there for close to 20 years. He's extremely effective. He's weathered all of these storms, and he's actually built a risk mitigation strategy based on his experience with the Great Recession to ensure that while we do see the markets, while we've seen them fall, he's had tools to make sure that they didn't fall as dramatically as they would have otherwise because of the experience that he has. So the good news is they know what they're doing. They know what they need to do to help the CalSTRS ship weather this storm. But that's not the only aspects. CalRTA is also here to protect CalSTRS. And CalSTRS, CalRTA was a great supporter of CalSTRS. CalRTA worked with CalSTRS, worked with stakeholders, the legislature, Department of Finance, and the governor's office during the dot-com bust. During the Great Recession, CalSTRS had supported CTA and worked with CalSTRS to pass AB 1469 in 2014. And just to note, even though it happened in 2014, it took almost 10 years of constant work and advocacy with various education stakeholders and the legislature to create this full funding package for AB 1469. So the reality is this is a long-term conversation. It will continue to be a long-term conversation, and this conversation really can't take place without groups like CalRTA to make sure that CalSTRS is well represented and protected. So CalRTA continues to support CalSTRS and has really now become a conduit for both stakeholder and legislative engagement, working with a number of other education organizations, school, community college districts. We've been working to help coalesce various stakeholder groups to have conversations with legislative leadership, with the governor, Department of Finance, and CalSTRS to try to figure out what kind of comprehensive discussions we need to ensure that we can weather this storm together. So at this point, I did want to engage you all with our second poll. And our second poll is, do you believe that CalRTA is effectively working to protect your retirement security? So let's ask, oh my goodness. So your answers can be yes, no, or not sure. Do you believe that CalRTA is effectively working to protect your retirement security? Let's give you just a few minutes to be able to make your selection. And after you make your selection, please remember to click on the submit button at the bottom of your poll. I have to say you're all very effective because your numbers are coming in very quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll up and want to say thank you very much. 80% of you believe that Cal RTA is effectively working to protect your retirement. None of you voted no, and 13% of you are not sure. So thank you very much for participating in that poll. We're now going to move on to the last part of this workshop. And that's going to be the question and answer segment. I did want to note that we did have a few questions submitted to us ahead of time, and we do have 4 different aspects that we wanted to touch upon. So just in case you were going to ask a question relating to the SBMA or Supplemental Benefit Maintenance Account, we're going to be talking about that. Dave was also going to touch on the Supreme Court again briefly. I'm also going to be touching upon the 2% COLA and rumors that some have heard about cuts to benefits. So if any of you were thinking about asking questions regarding any of those issues, don't worry about it. We've got you covered. But if you have a question that wasn't included in any of those 4 issues I just went over, please feel free to click on the question arrow and type a question, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as we can. Dave, can I ask if you don't mind starting off with SBMA and Supreme Court?
Sure thing. Thank you, Jennifer. On the SBMA first, the State Supplemental Benefit Maintenance Account is the account that makes the quarterly payments to retirees who have lost more than 15% of the value of their pension and lost it to inflation. That account has a vested contribution from the state, and that contribution from the state is more than sufficient to meet the annual cost of the SBMA. So for those who've been concerned because of the drop in the stock market, there is no need to be concerned. The supplemental payments will be made. They'll be made at the protection level of 85% of your original allowance as adjusted for inflation, and be made on the quarterly basis because there is sufficient money and will continue to be sufficient money to do that. On the Supreme Court, this set of cases that are in front of them that they heard oral arguments on, and we expect an opinion in August. This is the second. The first set they heard, and they did not act on it because they did not act on a change to the California rule because the court decided that the issue in front of them did not involve the California rule. We believe and hope that they'll make the same conclusion on the case in front of them now. There is a way of doing a very narrow interpretation, and we hope the court adopts that. If they do, there is still one more case that will be in front of the court sometime later this year or next year, and that is the Marin Public Employees Association versus Marin County. And that is another that has a specific reference to the California rule. So we have successfully navigated one. We hope to successfully navigate the second. And we do not know what the schedule is or when the Supreme Court will decide to hear oral arguments and make a decision on the third.
And my apologies, I didn't put my webcam back up. And let me touch on briefly 2% COLA and cuts to benefits. We also have a number of very important questions that you've asked. I want to try to take a few minutes to cover as many of those as we can. I also want to make sure that you know that any questions that we're not able to answer, Dave and I are going to go through all the questions and make sure we answer them. And we will make sure that we provide that information on the CalRTA website so that you'll be able to see this. This presentation is also going to be uploaded to the CalRTA website. So in case you missed it or you have a friend that missed it, you want to make sure that they can watch it. You can either have them watch it on Friday and register for that on Friday, or you can always go to the CalRTA website and click on the links that you need to go to not only this presentation, but also to the questions and answers we weren't able to get to. I did want to briefly note, I did have some of you reach out regarding the COLA. Some of you were worried that because there is a shortfall to the budget and because there are conversations about pensions, do you need to worry about your 2% COLA going away? No, you don't need to worry. There are no discussions about changing those decisions. That's now something that is your benefit. That's yours, that they can't take away. So there are no discussions about impacting that 2% COLA. And there are also absolutely no discussions about cutting or reducing either your benefits or the benefits of any active or future CalSTRS members. There are no discussions taking place within the legislature or the governor or Department of Finance or at CalSTRS about eliminating your retirement benefits or about eliminating benefits to existing or future members. Even if the CalSTRS board did have to lower the rate of return, that does not mean that any of your benefits or any of the benefits of our future CalSTRS members are going to be reduced at all. So I did want to make sure. I know that there is a lot of anxiety out there. There's some information that might be shared with individuals that may not be reflective of the facts that are being discussed at the legislature. No one is discussing eliminating your retirement benefits. I know that's a big one, so you can breathe easier there. Let's go to, let me pull up another question. Do you think that California legislators understand that a great many California teachers lose all Social Security benefits when they're considering switching to a defined benefit plan? If I had a nickel for every time a legislator didn't understand a CalSTRS related issue, I'd be a millionaire. No, they don't understand. To be fair, it's not because they're malicious. Remember, these are individuals that are going in. Many of them, some of them may have been on a school board, but more likely than not, most of them don't have experience in the education world. But as you know, they think that because they went to school, they know everything there is to know about education, which, as you know, is not always the case. Unfortunately, not. Most of them really don't know. It doesn't mean that they all don't care, but we have to constantly educate not only legislators, but their staff as well. You should note that the average tenure for an assembly staff member with one office is only a year. So by the time one staff member starts to understand, suddenly they move to another office and we have to start all over again. So it's a constant education and constant re-education that has to take place. So we're never able to rest on our laurels or feel secure as far as feeling confident that we can stop our work with the legislature. And Dave, we did have some people asking about some Social Security offsets. Would you like to provide a brief update on the work that we're doing?
CalRTA is continuing its advocacy, and we hope that you'll join the advocacy group and have your email and receive our advocacy alerts to help on the repeal of the windfall elimination provision and government pension offset. We are supporting and working on HR 141 by Representative Davis from Illinois. There are, can't remember how many co-sponsors we have now, but over 250, moving toward and hope to reach 290. But at this point, we are also including an additional set of advocacy, which is repeal or suspend to have the retirees receive their full Social Security benefits, have no WEP, no GPO offsets as part of the stimulus packages. The stimulus packages need to recognize that educators, retired educators, retirees tend to spend the money they receive. And if you want to stimulate the economy, not only can you get justice, but you can have a great economic benefit and help stimulate the economy at the same time by repealing the windfall elimination provision and government offset. We are continuing that advocacy, the Tuesdays and Thursdays. Thank you for everybody who are clicking on, working on receiving more co-sponsors to HR 141. The reason for the 290 is Speaker Pelosi has a rule that if you have 290 co-sponsors, your bill will be heard. So we appreciate the Speaker having that rule. We are trying to use it. And at the same time, also try to use the stimulus packages to achieve both justice and stimulus by repeal.
Thank you so much, Dave. And we only have time for one more brief comment that I'm going to make, and then we will try to address all the other questions. I did want to note that while there are any proposed changes to your benefits or benefits for future members, it is possible that we might see additional attacks on defined benefit or retired benefits. And so what we want to do is ensure that CalSTRS and CalRTA are in positions that are strong. It might be necessary for CalRTA members to step up their activism at the statewide level in order to ensure that CalSTRS is on strong footing for the future. So that's going to leave us to our final poll. And that poll is, would you be interested in a future CalRTA webinar? Please vote yes, no, and don't forget to click your response. What we're trying to do is assess your needs and your wants. We're trying to assess what you think would be the most effective way for us to help you to be educated on issues in relation to CalSTRS, in relation to what CalRTA is doing, and also in relation to what you can do to help to make sure that your retirement benefits stay secure, but also to help CalSTRS to stay in a very positive economic footing. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and say thank you. 98% of you said yes, you would be interested in another webinar. So I have to say thank you. I do hope that you have found this information to be valuable. And Dave and I would be more than happy to conduct future webinars. If you know someone that might be interested in a webinar that we're going to have on Friday, please share that information with them and ask them to register, and again, to look for this information on the CalRTA website. On behalf of myself, I wanted to say thank you for allowing me to be one of your new advocates to work with Dave. As you know, he is just such a tremendous resource, quite a bit of fun to work with. I've been working with him for about 20 years, and I'm sure a few of my gray hairs probably came from Dave as well.
And thank you all. And please go to the CalRTA website, go to the advocacy, and please sign up for the advocacy alerts. We're all in this together. We will be successful. Need your help, and we always appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You all have a great and safe afternoon.